join us in this hymn, Welcome Holy Spirit, preparing ourselves to participate in this virtual Eucharistic celebration and also to be a part of spiritual communion, to open our hearts and ears to the Word of God. Let us ask Father for the Holy Spirit so that the same Spirit may guide us throughout this Mass.
Good evening, friends, and praise the Lord. ACE Choir welcomes you to this virtual Holy Mass. This Mass was celebrated in the Archdiocese of Toronto by Monsignor Robert Nuska. Before beginning the Mass, I request all of you to keep your phones in silent mode. Thank you. Let's make sign of the cross in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Let's all rise for the entrance hymn.
Celebrate God with your hands. Celebrate God with your voice.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The Lord be with you. Brothers and sisters, to celebrate worthily now the mystery of our faith, let us call to mind our sins and ask the Lord for pardon and for strength. You were sent to heal the contrite of heart. Lord, have mercy.
Lord, have mercy.
You came to call sinners. Christ, have mercy.
Christ, have
You are
mercy.
seated at the right hand of the Father to intercede for us. Lord, have mercy.
Lord, have mercy.
May Almighty God have mercy on us, forgive us our sins, and bring us all to everlasting life.
Amen.
Glory be to the Father, glory be to the Son, glory be to the Spirit, all glory to our God. We praise you, we bless you, we give you thanks. We praise you for your glory. We praise you, we bless you, we worship you, O Lord our God. Glory be to the Father, glory be to the Son, glory be to the Spirit, all glory to our God. Lord Jesus Christ, only Son of God, you are one with the Father. Receive our prayer. Glory be to the Father, glory be to the Son, glory be to the Spirit, all glory to our God. You alone are the Holy One. You alone are the Lord. With the Holy Spirit, in the glory of God. Glory be to the Father. Glory be to the Son. Glory be to the Spirit, all glory to our God.
Let us pray. O God, who have united the many nations in confessing your name, grant that those reborn in the font of baptism may be one in the faith of their hearts and the homage of their deeds. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever.
Amen.
In today's first reading, we'll get to know that Peter says to people in Solomon's portico that repent and turn to God so that your sins may be wiped out.
First reading, a reading from the First reading, a reading from Acts of the Apostles, chapter 3, verse 11 to 26. While he clung to Peter and John, all the people ran together to them in the portico called Solomon Portico, utterly astonished. When Peter saw it, he addressed the people, "You Israelites, why do you wonder at this? Or why do you stare at us, as though by our own power of pity we had made him walk? The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the God of our ancestor has glorified his servant Jesus, whom you handed over and rejected in the presence of Pilate, though he had decided to release him. But you rejected the holy and righteous one and asked to have a murderer given to you, and you killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. To this we are witnesses, and by faith in his name itself has made this man strong, whom you see and know, and the faith that is through Jesus has given him this perfect health in the presence of all of you. And now, friends, I know that you acted in the ignorance, as did also your rulers. In this way, God fulfilled what He had foretold through all the prophets, that His Messiah would suffer. Repent, therefore, and turn to God, so that your sins may be wiped out, so that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord, and that He may send the Messiah appointed for you, that is, Jesus, who must remain in heaven until the time of universal restoration that God announced long ago through his holy prophets. Moses said, "The Lord your God will raise up for you from your own people a prophet like me. You must listen to whatever he tells you, and it will be that everyone who does not listen to that prophet will be utterly rooted out of the people." And all the prophets, as many as have spoken from Samuel and those after him, also predicted these days. You are the descendants of the prophet and of the covenant that God gave to your ancestor, saying to Abraham, "And in your descendants all the families of the earth shall be blessed." When God raised up his servant, he sent him first to you, to bless you by turning each of you from your wicked ways. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
O Lord our God, how wonderful your name in all the earth. O Lord our God, how wonderful your name in all the earth. O Lord, how sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. What are human beings that you are mindful of them? Mortals that you care for them. O Lord our God, how wonderful your name in all the earth. Yet you have made them a little lower than God, and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet. O Lord our God, how wonderful your name in all the earth. All sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. O Lord our God, how wonderful your name in all the earth.
Let us all rise for acclamation.
Alleluia, 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 Alleluia. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad. Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia.
In today's Gospel reading, we'll hear that Jesus appears to his disciples and opened their minds to understand the scriptures.
The Lord be with you. And with your spirit. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
The 2 disciples told the 11 and their companions what had happened on the road to Emmaus, and how Jesus had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. While they were talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you frightened? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I, myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, he said to them, Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate in their presence. Then Jesus said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written that the Messiah is to suffer and to rise from the dead on the 3rd day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So, my dear friends, during these days of the octave of Easter, the Gospels continue to show us how, again, this news of the empty tomb begins to spread. We're reminded, as Luke shows us today in this Gospel, within the larger context of the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, that the road to the joy of Easter is precisely that. It's a road. It's a journey. The joy of the Easter faith will arrive, but it may take time. The initial stages of this journey toward clarity, again, leads us to reflect on the question, what will we find? The Gospel of Mark, the empty tomb remains a sign, but at least, again, it elicits at first not joy, but fear. We see in the Gospel of Mark, they went out and fled from the tomb for trembling, and in astonishment they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. John's Gospel, news of the Lord's resurrection, is met with disbelief or doubt, at least in the case of Thomas. Insiders are in a state of fear. The appearance of our Lord to Mary Magdalene, we saw on Tuesday, is met with confusion, as she thinks Jesus is the gardener. Others cast doubt on the resurrection from the very start. We see this in the Gospel of Matthew. But the empty tomb remains an essential sign, not only for us, but for the whole world, indeed to the naysayers in our own time, if only as a sign of contradiction and a stumbling block to the values of a narcissistic and disbelieving world. That the Christian faith, going back to the empty tomb, continues to spark controversy in our time should come as no surprise, for St. Augustine reminds us, on no point does the Christian faith, he writes, encounter more opposition than on the mystery of the resurrection of the body. Luke tells us in today's gospel then, as the disciples on the road to Emmaus are relating to the 11, their companions, what's happened to them. Now, Jesus comes and stands in their midst, in the midst of this larger group. Once again, the initial reaction is not joy, but fear. We heard, they are startled, terrified. They thought they were seeing a ghost. So Jesus calms their fears. He invites them to look more closely at him. He shows them his hands, his feet. Luke goes on to tell us that while in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, they were starting to come to faith. So Jesus gives them further proof that he's risen by eating a piece of fish in their presence. We saw earlier that just as our Lord appears to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and Luke tells us that they are sad, maybe in our circumstances, given the difficult circumstances in which we find ourselves, we too may be sad. There's great uncertainty in our time. The continuing to deal with the effects of the coronavirus is certainly having its impact and effect. We may be sad, again, and not without good reason, but as we follow with faith the various gospel accounts of the resurrection appearances of our Lord, we see very clearly a positive movement in the direction of joy, of peace, as we move like the apostles and the first witnesses from the desolation of broken dreams to hope, from spiritual blindness to clarity of vision. We're called from confusion or bewilderment to understanding, from sadness, suffering, from death to the world of interior peace and the joy of the everlasting life. Ultimately, these resurrection stories show us how the risen Lord then appears in the midst of his followers, yet opening up in their eyes the vision of the resurrection faith. The Gospels remind us how our Lord calls to people again exactly where they are. We're reminded of the beginnings of his earthly ministry, calling the first disciples on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, calling them by name, precisely as they are in the midst of a day's work. So also the risen Lord continues to come out in search of us, who may be dejected like the disciples on the road to Emmaus. We see that the Lord continues to speak to us in many ways in our own time, the risen Lord, through the sacramental life of the church, through the life of prayer, through the voices of the poor, especially those who are suffering, those in our time who we need to console. They may be mourning the sickness or the death of their loved ones. We need to pray again for those involved in the medical treatment of those who are sick. In the spirit then of humility, of service, of communion with the Trinitarian God, Jesus calls us, like the first disciples, to be heralds of the new evangelization in a difficult moment. And so to help others to move from sadness, from perplexity to joy in the Easter faith. So as we continue to celebrate this Mass, we pray for the grace always to encounter our risen Christ in the Eucharist that we're celebrating. The teachings of the Church remind us that the Eucharist is really and truly a glimpse of heaven appearing on earth, a glorious ray of the heavenly Jerusalem that pierces the clouds of our history and lights up our journey. Here St. Ephrem reminds us, to conclude, as we prepare now for Pentecost, that the one who consumes the Eucharist with faith eats fire and spirit. Take then, he writes, and eat this, all of you, and consume with the Holy Spirit. Jesus says, whoever eats this bread will have eternal life. Brothers and sisters, let us now make our prayers and petitions to God in heaven. Loving Father, we ask you to continue to be with your church, with the Holy Father, the bishops, the priests, the deacons, with all your people, especially in places where the gift of the Mass may not be currently available. Today, as we come together as a community from many different countries around the world, we ask your guidance during these difficult times. We pray to the Lord. Again, for all those who have died from, those suffering from, those involved in the medical treatment of those suffering from the coronavirus and their families, we pray to the Lord. And for the intentions of today's Mass, we pray to the Lord. Heavenly Father, we ask you to hear the prayers we've made and those that remain deep within our hearts, for we make them all through Christ our Lord.
Amen. Lord, accept
pray, brothers and sisters, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God, the Almighty Father.
May the Lord accept the sacrifice for the praise and glory of His name, for our good and the love of His church.
Graciously be pleased, O Lord, to accept the sacrificial gifts that we offer joyfully, both for those who have been reborn and in hope of your increased help from heaven. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
Lift up your hearts. Let us give thanks to the Lord our God. It is truly right and just, our duty and our salvation at all times to acclaim you, O Lord, but in this time above all, to laud you yet more gloriously when Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. For he is the true Lamb who has taken away the sins of the world. By dying he has destroyed our death. By rising restored our life. Therefore, overcome with paschal joy, every land, every people exults in your praise. Even the heavenly powers and the angelic hosts sing together the unending hymn of your glory as they acclaim. You are indeed holy, O Lord, the fount of all holiness. Make holy, therefore, these gifts, we pray, by sending down your Spirit upon them like the dewfall, so that they may become for us the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. At the time he was betrayed and entered willingly into his passion, he took bread, and giving thanks, broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body, which will be given up for you." In a similar way, when supper was ended, he took the chalice, and once more giving thanks, he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this, all of you, and drink from it, for this is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and eternal covenant, which will be poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in memory of me."
My Lord, my God.
The mystery of faith.
We proclaim your death, O Lord, and profess your resurrection until you come again.
celebrate the memorial of his death and resurrection, we offer you, Lord, the bread of life and the chalice of salvation, giving thanks that you have held us worthy to be in your presence and minister to you. Humbly we pray that, partaking of the body and blood of Christ, we may be gathered into one by the Holy Spirit. Remember, Lord, your church spread throughout the world, and bring her to the fullness of charity, together with Francis, our Pope, Thomas, our Bishop, and all the clergy. Remember also our brothers and sisters who have fallen asleep in the hope of the resurrection, and all who have died in your mercy. Welcome them into the light of your face. Have mercy on us all, we pray, that with the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, with blessed Joseph, her spouse, with the blessed apostles, and all the saints who have pleased you throughout the ages, we may merit to be co-heirs to eternal life, and may praise and glorify you through your Son, Jesus Christ. Through him, and with him, and in him, O God, Almighty Father, in the unity of the Holy Spirit, all glory and honor is yours forever and ever.
Amen.
At the Savior's command, informed by divine teaching, we dare to say,
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us, Lord, from evil.
deliver us, Lord, we pray, from every evil. Graciously grant peace in our days, that by the help of your mercy, we may be always free from sin and safe from all distress, as we await the blessed hope and the coming of our Savior, Jesus Christ.
For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever.
Lord Jesus Christ, who said to your apostles, "Peace I leave you, my peace I give you," look not on our sins, but on the faith of your church, and graciously grant her peace and unity in accordance with your will, who live and reign forever and ever.
Amen.
The peace of the Lord be with you always.
And with your spirit.
Lamb of God,
You take away the sins of the world. Have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world. Have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world. Grant us peace.
Behold the Lamb of God, behold him who takes away the sins of the world. Blessed are those called to the supper of the Lamb.
Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter the mine,
But only say the word, and my soul shall
shall
live.
live.
Since we cannot receive the Holy Communion, let us all remember our best moment when we received the body and blood of Christ. Remembering that, let us partake in the spiritual communion by saying this act of spiritual communion. Prayer. O Immaculate Queen of heaven and earth, Mother of God and mediator of every grace, I believe that your dearly beloved Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, is truly, really, and substantially contained in the most holy sacrament. I love him above all things and long to receive him in my heart, since now I
so good to place him spiritually in my soul and never permit me to be separated from him. Amen.
Make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring your love. Where there is injury, your pardon, Lord. And where there's doubt, to faith in you. O Master, grant that I may never see so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love with all my soul. Make me a channel of your peace. Where there's despair in life, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, only light. And where there's sadness, ever joy. O Master, grant that I may never see so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love with all my soul. Make me a channel of your peace. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, in giving to each one that we receive, and in dying that we're born to eternal life. O Master, grant that I may never see so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love with all my soul. Channel of your peace. My life is in you, Lord. My strength is in you, Lord. My hope is in you, Lord. In you, it's in you. My life is in you, Lord. My strength is in you, Lord. My hope is in you, Lord. In you, it's in you. I'll praise you with all of my life. I'll praise you with all of my strength, with all of my life, with all of my strength. All of my hope is in you. My life is in you, Lord. My strength is in you, Lord. My hope is in you, Lord. In you, it's in you. My life is in you, Lord. My strength is in you, Lord. My hope is in you, Lord. In you, it's in you. In you, it's in you. In you, it's in you. Let us say the prayer after communion of St. Thomas. I thank you, Lord, Almighty Father, everlasting God, for having been pleased through no merit of mine
but of your great mercy alone, to feed me, a sinner, and your unworthy servant, with the precious body and blood of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. I pray that this Holy Communion may not be for my judgment and condemnation, but for my pardon and salvation. Let this Holy Communion be to me an armor of faith and a shield of goodwill, a cleansing of all vices, and a rooting out of all evil desires. May it increase love and patience, humility and obedience, and all virtues. May it be a firm defense against the evil designs of all my visible and invisible enemies, a perfect quieting of all the desires of soul and body. May this Holy Communion bring about a perfect union with you, the one true God, and at last enable me to reach eternal bliss when you will call me. I pray that you bring me, a sinner, to the indescribable feast where you, with your Son and the Holy Spirit, are to your saints true light, full blessedness, everlasting joy, and perfect happiness, through the same Christ our Lord. Amen.
Let us say the prayer for priests of Saint Teresa of Lisieux. Lisieux, O Jesus, eternal priest, keep your priests within the shelter of your sacred heart, where none may touch them. Keep unstained their anointed hands, which daily touch your sacred body. Keep unsullied their lips, daily purpled with your precious blood. Keep pure and unearthly their hearts, sealed with the sublime mark of the priesthood. Let your holy love surround them and shield them from the world's contagion. Bless their labors with abundant fruit, and may the souls to whom they minister be their joy and consolation, here and in heaven, their beautiful and everlasting crown.
Amen.
Let us pray. Hear, O Lord, our prayers, that this most holy exchange by which you have redeemed us may bring your help in this present life and ensure for us eternal gladness through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
The Lord be with you.
And with your
May
spirit.
Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Go forth, the Mass is ended. Alleluia, alleluia.
Thanks be to God. Alleluia, alleluia.
Oh, how we love Mary to praise Loving Father, we thank you for giving us this gift of life. Help us, Lord, that we may not take this life as granted and live a comfortable, easier, or a lukewarm life. Give us the strength to unlearn each and every day. Accept our faults and justify your love by our life struggle, and help us that when we are testifying your love, we may spread your love and peace. There should not be any kind of pride or for our glory. Help us, Lord, give us that strength that we may break ourselves, we may become new, born again in spirit. For this we pray, our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. We'll say the Memorare together. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession, was left unaided. Inspired with this confidence, I fly to thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my Mother. To thee do I come, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer me. Amen.
O Queen of Heaven, rejoice now. Alleluia. Rejoice, for he who married though despair. Alleluia. He is risen as he foretold. Alleluia. Pray for us to the Father. Alleluia. Rejoice and be glad, O Virgin Mary. Alleluia. For the Lord has truly risen. Alleluia. Let us pray. O God, you deign to give joy to the world through the resurrection of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Grant, we beseech you, that through his mother, the Virgin Mary, we may obtain the joys of everlasting life through the same Christ our Lord. Amen.
Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Virgin Mary,
Pray for us.
Saint Mother Teresa,
Pray for us.
Saint Joseph,
Pray for us.
Saint Paul,
Pray for us.
Saint Jose Maria Escriva,
Pray for us.
Sign of the Cross.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
is leading the Divine Mercy Novena every day live at 3:15 p.m. on the YouTube channel. It started on 10th of April and will be ending on 18th of April to prepare ourselves for the Divine Mercy Sunday. Do join us for the novena at 3:15 p.m. Also invite your friends and family members to join us in this Divine Mercy Novena. Thank you for participating with us in this virtual Holy Mass.